Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 4th of April. Today we're going to be talking about Bakhmut mainly, but I will first begin by talking about Vuhledar. And this is because I was actually sent a very interesting video by a member of our Discord server, which you can join in the description. And he basically just requested that I cover it in the video. So I'm going to start doing this from now on. If you have any sort of video that you want me to geolocate or that you geolocated yourself that could be added to the map, then I'll just add it in as a marker. And if you want, I could just talk about it in the video quickly, explain its relevance and how it is related to the current situation. So this video is actually very interesting, and it gives us a lot of insight into the sort of munitions that Russia is firing, specifically on Vuhledar, even now in April, even though their offensive here really halted around early February, late January, and that time. So like several months ago. But even now we're still seeing that the Russians are continually firing upon the Ukrainian positions in these high-rise apartments in Vuhledar. But this video that was geolocated by this user was actually in the garage area in this specific instance. Although there was other thermite munitions that hit the apartments, a lot of them were fired at these garages over here, which again indicates that Ukraine does have some sort of firing position over here. Maybe they have some trenches that are dug in between the garages, or any sort of like equipment that is stored within the garages. I'm sure that's the case, and so those are also important targets to talk about. And so in the video you could see that there are incendiary munitions fired, and most likely they are fired out of BM-21 grads. And so these incendiary munitions, they are fired from 122 millimeter rockets, and the one that was probably used in this case was a 9M22S rocket, which is a surface-to-surface rocket, primarily used against infantry, vegetation, just flammable objects in general. And it has a payload of 180 unfused ML5 magnesium cups, and those are sort of like these hexagonal shaped cups, and inside of them you have this really concoction of thermite. It's just mixed together with these different chemicals, and then once they're launched from the BM-21, like immediately after ejection, that's when it's fused, and then that's when it ignites. And the burn time for the munitions is about 2 minutes. It could go over that, and the burn temperature is about 2,000 degrees Celsius or 3,632 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's really, really hot, to put it mildly. So it could easily burn these sort of structures. It could easily burn vegetation, for instance, like the vegetation around Vuhledar, you can see over here. And if it gets into contact with human flesh, then it could lead to some very severe burning, or it could lead to death. And so that's why it is such a fatal munition. And because it only gets hotter when it comes into contact with water, and a lot of the internal body of humans contains water. About 80% of the human body is water, basically. And so that would only make it more and more flammable. It just leads to a feedback loop, which is very fatal for any sort of infantry that is in the area. And so that's why they have to take cover within structures that might be less flammable, or in basements. So that's really what's been going on around here. The Russians aren't just using these incendiary munitions, they're also using precision guided munitions. And so they're similar to the American JDAM kits. The Ukraine, they got some JDAM ER kits recently, and so the Russians, they have their own analogs of this. Some of them are being added to the Fab 500, for instance, which could really turn it into a very lethal weapon, because it does generate a very high explosive yield. And so we'll see if that could be used potentially in Vuhledar, where there are a lot of structures that really they need these high explosive yields to incur some sort of damage to them. So that's basically the situation in Vuhledar. Before I move on, though, I want to talk about the fact that the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, I said they were in Avdiivka. Maybe they do have some battalions over there, but I've now just been looking through some footage from Vuhledar, and I did see that in recent videos that are before maybe they're from about a week or two ago. You see the 72nd Brigade in there, and specifically the 1st Mechanized Battalion of the brigade. And so I'm pretty confident that they at least have some units from within the 72nd Brigade still in Vuhledar. And we know that they have recently destroyed a Russian T-72, for instance. They destroyed one supply truck of the Russians as it was going to the front line. It probably carried some fuel, some ammo. And so that's just, the general situation in Vuhledar. No large attacks coming in from either side. I don't expect anything to occur here anytime soon. Let's go and talk about Bakhmut, which is really the main focus of this video. So we'll go up. So over here, I want to talk about the situation in Korsunskoho Streets because we've been hearing from some Ukrainian sources in recent days that the Ukrainians have been able to conduct a limited counterattack in this area. Some of their maps show that any sort of Russian gains to the north of Korsunskoho Street were erased, and so Ukraine in essence would have taken back this entire polygon over here. And then I saw some footage that was released from this general area purporting to show that the Ukrainians made gains, but if you look at the footage, it doesn't really prove anything about the approximate front line that we didn't know before. So here we have the Ukrainians firing a UR-77 mine clearing charge on Russian positions, and then it landed over here. And so this doesn't really contradict the original front line that I mapped out, for instance, because this area is to the south of Korsunskoho Street, and nobody's really alleging that the area directly to the north of it is under Russian control, for instance. And so either way, the video is interesting because the UR-77s, those are Russian vehicles, and that's Russian equipment. So it seems likely that the Ukrainians captured this and are now using it not to clear mines, but to use it against, actually in like an anti-personnel capacity, because it is something that apparently the Russians used in Mariupol in certain instances against some of the fortified positions over there. And so it seems Ukraine is now using the one UR-77 they have in the area to this same use, just using whatever they have to keep the Russians at bay for as long as possible. Now let's go to the main focus of this video, which is the Russian gains in the western part of Bakhmut. So ever since yesterday, the Wagner group has just continued taking over block after block, and the Ukrainians, they're not really fighting for these blocks anymore. They've made a concerted effort to withdraw towards the rail line. And so let's go through some of the facilities that the Russians have been able to take as a result. And so, for instance, they took over this Foreign Language Institute, they took over a tax office, they took over numerous stores, they took over restaurants. You could see the logos over here, for instance. I'll show you, they took over a Hotel Atlantic, which used to be a sort of a lodging point for the Ukrainians a few months ago. It was sort of like their barracks. That's where they'd stay. And here you could see some other facilities like a tax office that was taken over, a mall, district building administration was taken yesterday, I recall. Here, if you go a bit north, you could see that a grocery store was taken, a cosmetics store was taken. There is also school number 11 in Bakhmut, which was taken over, and this school is directly adjacent to the soccer stadium over here. And then adjacent to that soccer stadium, you have another hotel where you probably had Ukrainian forces that were using it as a barracks. So several important structures that are used to just hold back the Russians that are now being taken over with not much of a fight anymore, because the Russians, the Ukrainians, are really retreating towards this area over here, this red line that I'm drawing. And so in the coming days, you could expect the Russians to continue to take over these blocks over here without much of a fight. If we go up, we'll see that the Russians, they have been able to advance on several axes. So for instance, they advanced from the south from the original front line that looked like this around the Azom district. They pushed to the south and took over the remaining facilities in the Azom district. And a lot of these could have been used in theory as really good defensive points and firing positions, but the Ukrainians simply don't have the capabilities to hold on to it. They're overextended. They don't have enough men. At this point, yeah, they are totally outnumbered in Bakhmut, and they also do not have the proper ammunition, and so they want to really narrow the front line and get it closer to their remaining supply lines. And so yeah, they have had to make difficult decision of retreating from certain areas. Also, the Russians are advancing from the east. They have been able to take over this pretty large hospital, and so there was some fighting reported there earlier today. If you zoom in, you see it's a pretty large facility, and that entire area was and still is contested. If we look around, we see that the Russians, they have also been able to take over the rail station, not the rail station that is a bit to the west over here that I'm going in red over, but the one over here. This is called the Bakhmut train station number 1. I'm gonna go over its perimeter in a rectangle so you can see. This rail station is pretty historic. There's a museum nearby. There's some cargo. There's a few structures adjacent to it. So yeah, it is a good position for setting up fortifications. But again, the Ukrainians had to withdraw from here because Russia was attacking from multiple axes, and there was a threat of encirclement. Like you see from the north, there was an attack. From the east, there was an attack. And so yeah, it's simply not tenable to hold on to those positions. So yeah, they have started to retreat towards the rail line. If we go to the north, no reported gains yet around this more, you could say, suburban part of Bakhmut. It is still a part of the urban area, but it's just one-story houses, private residences, a bit more spread out. So this is, again, as I said before, an area where Russia could potentially advance through in the future. On the front line, there are a few apartment buildings, but I looked through Google Earth and they're like 3 or 4 stories high, so it's not as large as the apartment buildings that we'll talk about in western Bakhmut near the entrance of the city, and so it shouldn't be that big of an issue to take them over. And then as you go further south, you encounter, again, many of these more spread out, less sparse or more sparsely populated parts of Bakhmut. So for instance, this polygon over here, it shouldn't be that difficult to take over. It's very similar to taking over some of the suburbs of Bakhmut that were fought over before, like the Bakhmutka district in eastern Bakhmut over here. And so that's not the main issue for the Russians in terms of taking over the rest of Bakhmut. The main issue will be the district directly to the south of it, which is the one over here I'm going to get to in a second. First, let's talk about Bohdanivka. Bohdanivka, remember, Russia tried assaulting that town numerous times, but they never succeeded in breaking through into the limits of the city itself. But they always retained control of some positions nearby, like this train station over here and some areas near the reservoir. And so now, after some weeks of stalling, the Russians have resumed their advance around here, taking over some of the fields adjacent to this town, and they've actually entered the northern outskirts, taking over the first buildings. So this was reported by both sides. The Ukrainians, they reported that they repulsed the attack. What this means is that the Russians are attacking in that direction, and it's confirmed by the Ukrainians. And the Russians, they're saying that they've been able to gain a foothold in the town. As I said in previous videos, Bohdanivka is on a valley, but all the areas to the north of it, to the south of it, and to the west of it are in higher elevation, so it could become a threat for the Russians if they enter the valley and then they're surrounded on all sides and fired upon. So they're going to have to find a way to deal with that. I think the best solution would be to take on Hrihorivka, take over the town. Again, it's not that big of a town, and if it was taken, it would flank Bohdanivka and would give the Russians the proper firing positions to attack the Ukrainian garrisons of Bohdanivka. And according to the Russian sources, there are numerous Ukrainian forces in Bohdanivka that are trying relentlessly to hold on to the current front line. And so this entire point of holding on to the front line around here, around Bohdanivka, Hrihorivka, is to prevent Ukraine's northern flank from collapsing, because once Hrihorivka falls, Ukraine, they won't be able to defend the water canal. The Russians will cross it, and they'll be able to flank Chasiv Yar from the north, and that would be a huge issue, because the Ukrainians, at least when you zoom out, their flanks are still protected, so they could still withdraw across the water canal. But if the Russians got a foothold across it before the withdrawal was complete, then it could pull a huge amount of Ukrainian forces that are
around Ivanivske, around Kromove, or in Bakhmut itself, in huge danger. And also, obviously, it will put the Ukrainian forces on the rear around Chasiv Yar in danger as well. Let's go to the situation in Western Bakhmut one more time. Let's go to Google Earth. You see this polygon over here? This is the apartment cluster in Western Bakhmut. This is probably the last area where Ukraine can make a concerted effort to defend against the Russians and protract it for a very long time. Because if you really zoom in, look at these. These are some pretty huge structures. You have schools, you have, of course, apartment buildings, hospitals, medical college, and again, they're sort of structured in this sort of rectangle or square formation. And so if you enter one of the open areas in between any of these apartment buildings, then you're going to be surrounded on all sides by different windows and roofs, and it's a very easy area to get caught in as sort of a death trap, with the Ukrainians dug in at the top of their firing positions around here. And so attacking it head on, which is what most people would expect to happen, is a huge issue. So if Ukraine or if Russia is able to bypass the eastern approaches of the cluster by attacking from the north, as I posited before, then they could catch the Ukrainians off guard and really surprise them before they have enough time to mount a successful defensive operation that extends the amount of time that the battle in Bakhmut goes on for a good few weeks, because it could potentially take a few weeks to clear out this entire area. Think of it. This entire apartment cluster is about the same size as Vuhledar, and they both have similar size apartment buildings. And so it is a huge task. Obviously, there's differences in topography and in sheer manpower. But again, the Russians, they launched 2 different offensives onto Vuhledar and both failed. And it's mainly because of the fact that the Ukrainians held the high ground and held these very good positions, firing positions on the top of the apartment buildings. And so, again, Russia doesn't want to repeat that mistake over here. So we'll see what happens with that. Now, that is all for today. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.